Good morning and welcome, everyone. We're so excited to have you join us this morning for our coffee break, this time on a Tuesday morning. It is the beginning of spring. We've had so many wildflowers popping up around the Sky Island region because of the winter rains that we had. Now we're wondering what's going on with the warm weather that we're having, especially here in Tucson. I'm Emily Burns. I'm the program director focusing on the Northern Sky Islands. And today we're so excited to hear from Dan Beckman. Dan has been working with the Science and Natural Resource Division at Saguaro National Park for over 12 years. This spring, he's made a transition and has come on staff with Sky Island Alliance to be our botanist. So we're so thrilled to have Dan joining our team. He brings a wealth of knowledge about plants and ecosystems, including springs in this area. And he's going to go into depth about a project he's been doing for the last year and a half or so in the Rincon Mountains of Saguaro National Park, just on the east side of Tucson.
So I'm Dan Beckman. I'm going to be sharing a kind of virtual tour of the Rincon Mountains, which I've had the great pleasure to explore a lot on work time with Saguaro National Park, as well as off the clock. I have here the Tona Autumn, or the Autumn language name for the range, which was shared to me by a couple colleagues. I'm not going to butcher the pronunciation, but that translates to Turkey Neck Mountain, which my colleagues were saying might have connection to like annual trips that were done traditionally to collect turkey feathers. I also wonder if it could have to do with the shape of the range, but cool to at least have that name. And I did want to, just before I start, say that my presentation will be focusing on natural history, of course, but there's really no separating natural and cultural history. And Autumn and various indigenous groups have been engaging with this mountain range for thousands of years and have shaped it in various ways. So that's something that we really can't separate when we talk about the biodiversity and the landscapes of a range like this. So to get ourselves situated here, as many of you know, the Rincon Mountains are the big Sky Island mountain range that is east of the city of Tucson. So I have here a map showing some of the land management boundaries. So most of the high country of the Rincons is within the Saguaro National Park boundary, and vast majority of that is federally designated wilderness. You can see kind of wrapping around the east side of the park, we have a significant portion of Coronado National Forest land. Most of that is federal wilderness as well. And you get some Forest Service recreational land on the north side around Reddington Pass. The other image shows just some of the natural boundaries of the Rincons. So it's closely connected to the Santa Catalina Mountains, which is known in town as Mount Lemon often. In some ways, the Rincons and Catalinas could be considered one mega range, but they're separated by that relatively high pass, Reddington Pass, which many of us are familiar with. Eastern Rincon water drains into the San Pedro River, which you can see there. The Rincons also have a small sister range on the east side called the Little Rincon Mountains that are traditionally kept separate and separated by Happy Valley and Happy Valley Road. And then we got Rincon Creek and Cienega Creek on the south side where Rincon waters are draining into. So the etymology of the range is quite telling and quite relevant to a lot of what I'm going to be talking about in this presentation. So Rincon in Spanish refers to a type of interior corner. So, literally the inside angle where two walls meet, which you can see on this graphic. The topography of the Rincons is creating that inside corner, which I assume is the origin of the name. This could also mean, kind of a nook, a secluded small space. And as I'll get into, this shape, this rincon is actually quite significant for the type of plants that are able to thrive in that zone of the rincons. Zooming out further, in context, so we've got on the left the rincon situated within the Madrean Sky Island region. So as many of you know, the Madrean Sky Islands are often referred to as this archipelago of mountain islands. So you can see really well in that map the way these various sky islands kind of serve as stepping stones between two major mountain systems in North America: the Sierra Madre to the south, and then the Rocky Mountains to the north, which here are represented by the Colorado Plateau southern extension. And you can see the rincons are at that northwest corner of the Sky Island region, at that binational region, chiefly in Arizona and Sonora. And on the east, I have another great graphic that is really getting into the heart of what my presentation is about. So here the Sky Island region is circled, and it's showing those different biological influences from different regions of the continent, and how they kind of all come to mingle and interact in different characteristic species in this region. So from the south, we've got the Madrean, or the mountain species from the Sierra Madre. We've got the neotropical, or I'll say subtropical species from southern low elevation. And then two major desert systems coming together, the Sonoran and the Chihuahuan. And then that interior chaparral, the kind of like shrubby landscapes sort of in central Arizona around Phoenix, having an influence, as well as that Rocky Mountain flora coming in from the north. So in addition to all these regional influences, the topography of the Sky Islands themselves creates a very dynamic environment, because we're going from low elevation desert, in the case of the Rincons, Sonoran Desert, all the way up to mixed conifer forest above 8,000 feet at the tops of the mountains. And this is a classic graphic showing those transitions as you move up, out of the desert into more of a grassland, into that open oak woodland sort of chaparral environment. And then as you get higher, the pines mixing in with the oaks, getting into true pine forest, and then even a little bit of mixed conifer forest, including Douglas firs and firs at the very top. And this graphic also does a great job of showing how aspect also plays a role in this. So north-facing areas getting less sun, those higher elevation forested zones can thrive a little bit lower than they can on the south side of the mountain. So one of the key local botanists who studied these questions of floristic geography was Stephen McLaughlin, who's also a co-author of the original Rincon Flora, which I'll talk about. He did some amazing analyses taking floras, so plant lists from different areas, different mountain ranges across the whole Southwest region, and basically analyzing where are the areas of strongest overlap in terms of the plants that occur there. And where can we kind of roughly draw these boundaries of somewhat shared floras. So that's a map he drew from this 1986 paper. He talks about how these basically represent, somewhat cohesive floristic areas that established themselves after the last ice age. So kind of as we moved into our more modern climate, and climate barriers and topographic barriers sort of limited species somewhat to certain zones. So McLaughlin calls our area the Apachean floristic area. And I wanted to note that this doesn't mean that these areas each have their own separate species. Of course, each of them do have endemic species that only occur in that floristic area. But these are kind of more or less consistent assemblages of species. So the Apachean floristic area, as I was talking about earlier, contains species from these different zones, but it's like a certain suite of species that tend to be able to survive in our area with our particular topographic and climate conditions. So moving back specifically into the Rincon flora, this is known as a very rich flora, even by the very rich standards of Madrean Sky Islands, which are a biodiversity hotspot globally. So some of the reasons for this is a relatively high elevational range. So, right above Tucson in the foothills on the west side, you get, Sonoran Desert around 3,000 feet. And then Mica Mountain, its highest summit, is up there at 8,666 feet. So a lot of elevational range, a lot of roughness and dynamic topography within that, cliffs, steep slopes, ridges, deep canyons. I'll be taking you on an adventure into some of those areas. And those very diverse floristic influences, which I've been talking about. Notably in the Rincons, we're kind of on the edge, one of the edges of the Sonoran Desert floristic region. So a lot of Sonoran Desert influence and a lot of subtropical influence from the south. Currently, kind of my recent updated flora efforts were at around like 1,270 species documented in the range. That does include non-natives and species that we have not seen in a very long time that might be extirpated. And this is a pretty similar count to where the Catalina flora is in terms of known species. So collection history in the Rincons is quite rich, especially for a range that, in modern times, there's no roads going up to the top. Access can be quite difficult. It involves a lot of hiking, but its status as a national monument and then a national park has attracted additional biologists and botanists and collectors out there. So quite a rich history. Going back to 1884, Cyrus Pringle were the earliest collections I could find from the Rincons. Some other noteworthy efforts were Jacob Bloomer, who collected a ton this one summer and fall. And it's amazing what he found in just a couple seasons. Charlotte and John Reeder, who were locally based grass experts. Charlotte is the daughter of another famous botanist and started early. So she was collecting, as you can see, for many, many decades in and around the Rincons. Then in the late 70s, early 80s, we get the first and only to this date really comprehensive flora effort, an effort to document all the species in the entire range. So this was Carol Jenkins, a graduate student who was working in the lower elevations of the Rincons and collecting a bunch. And then Janice Bowers and Stephen McLaughlin, who were collecting in the mid to high elevations, chiefly in the early to mid 80s, and published that comprehensive flora in 1987. Some other efforts in the 90s focusing on major canyons within the park. And then my efforts and all the people that I've been working with to get out and explore and collect and document more flora really started the fieldwork element back in 2017. So quickly visiting a few of these key figures. So this is Jacob Bloomer, who made a ton of amazing collections in the high country of the Rincons in the summer and fall of 1909. And it's quite poetic that Janice Bowers, who wrote the 80s full flora of the Rincons, she also published an article about the life of Jacob Bloomer. So he was a Swiss-born botanist who came out here and had a relatively brief run trying to be a freelance botanist. He struggled financially, ended up going back to Minnesota and spending the rest of his life as a farmer there. And that quote you can see is probably relatable to many people trying to make it as a botanist. He wrote to Forrest Shreve about it was never an easy matter, and he was just not able to make it work anymore. So he had to move back east. And following his adventures in the Rincons, he published an amazing paper in the Plant World, a journal in 1910, which is really getting at a lot of what I'm exploring in this presentation. So comparing the Rincons on different sides and how the geography and topography seem to affect what kind of plants and what kinds of habitats he was seeing. So in these passages, he's talking about the east slope of Mica Mountain, and specifically talking about the Spud Rock Spring aspen grove and how unique the understory and how rich that area is, and how that last sentence, such an occurrence would be next to impossible in a similar situation on the west side, which I would agree with. And that shows an image of kind of walking towards Spud Rock Spring Campground and seeing that understory that is along the side of that aspen grove. And this paper, he then gets into hypothesizing about the why of this. So, a very key consideration is the water and how the water moves through the mountains, through its bedrock, where it pops up, where it doesn't. So he's noting how soil water comes to the surface much more readily on the east side, which is probably explaining the richer soils and the ability to have a plant community like Spud Rock Spring on the high east side. And he's comparing that to the west side, where you see a phenomenon of a lot of impervious bedrock canyons and places where water flows, but it just shuttles very quickly off the mountain and doesn't as readily percolate into the soil. And I really love this passage at the bottom here. Ascending from Rincon Valley after a certain night shower, many a silver ribbon was seen from afar, glistening in the morning sun as it meandered down over smoothly polished rock. And that's an image that anyone who has spent time hiking around the Rincon Valley can probably picture that beautiful image. And then he talks about, to use like an economic metaphor, that the east side is economical with, not quote unquote wasting all of its water immediately, whereas the west side spends it recklessly because it just flows very quickly down that bedrock. It doesn't get into the soil as much. He also has some interesting theories about the wind and prevailing winds coming from the west off of the Gulf of California that may have a phenomenon of further drying out that west side and just heightening the evapotranspiration. Then moving to the Bowers and McLaughlin flora. So this was published in 1986 in the journal Desert Plants, which is still around. They are talking about the richness of the Rincon flora, and especially given McLaughlin's background in floristic analyses, they're talking about, what are the predominant themes of where plants are coming from or what their affinities are in the Rincons. And they highlight that the major affinities are to the south, so that both the Sonoran and Chihuahuan floras are felt very strongly in the Rincons. as well as those subtropical and Madrean species. So this gets into that in more detail, and really highlighting the exceptional diversity in the lower portions of the Rincons, where these subtropical and various desert elements are able to overlap. And that's a photo I took in a really unique area on the west side of Rincon Peak, where you have Mexican blue oaks in the overstory and subtropical feather tree Lysoloma in the understory. They talk about some of these unique species, which I'm going to get into in the Rincons, that make a home in that inner corner, in that Rincon, where they presumably, with the kind of insulating effect of the ridges themselves and the southern aspect, are able to receive protection from the harshest freezes and frosts, which would otherwise make it impossible for such a tropical species to thrive. And they are, musing about kind of where the origin, or kind of what the timeline might have been for those species arriving or persisting up here in the Rincons. And that's another feather tree looking very lush, tucked against a bedrock cliff. So then moving into the recent efforts, started in terms of fieldwork in 2017 out of a great idea by Don Swan, a retired biologist at Saguaro National Park. He read Bowers and McLaughlin's work and was alarmed and fascinated by species that had been collected around the turn of the century, often by Bloomer, that Bowers and McLaughlin had not been able to relocate during their field work in the 80s. And these were mostly high elevation species that need very specific microhabitats at the top of the mountain. So Don sent me off hunting for those lost species at the top of the mountain. We were able to track down most of them with a lot of effort. Some are still quote unquote missing. But from there, the project kind of took on a life of its own as we got further off trail and started finding species that had never been recorded in the Rincons or in the park, and just finding so much undocumented biodiversity. So that kind of, we're able to continue doing the work, getting funding to do these remote exploratory off-trail surveys, targeting areas of interest, especially places, major canyons and places where there was a lot of water. And this included backpacking to get to the most remote places where there's no trails or access is very difficult, and kind of posting up somewhere and exploring for a number of days. We've also made a big emphasis on community engagement and iNaturalist, and bringing in volunteers and just passionate naturalists from the community. And that has paid huge dividends just in terms of survey partners and leads on interesting plants that we would follow up on. And then as much as I could, me and my main collaborator on the flora, Ethan Ward, outside of work time, would try and do some exploration outside of the park, especially in the Forest Service land. So additional remote canyons, limestone areas, which are not very prominent within the park, but in the outlying Forest Service areas are, and some of those nasty cattle tanks, which are my least favorite habitats, but they are interesting places where their unique plants grow. So you got to check them out if you're doing a flora. So that myself and that collaborator I mentioned, Ethan Ward, we do intend to publish a full updated Rincon flora, hopefully in the next few years, to report on all of these efforts. So I talked about kind of where the list is now. That is publicly available as a working checklist on SciNet. And since 2017, we've been able to add around 146 native species to the Rincon flora, with about 90 of those being found in the park and 55 of those So far only being found outside the park. So now we will finally get to the virtual tour. So to orient ourselves again, kind of three major peaks in the Rincons. We have Tanque Verde Ridge on the west side. Its summit, Tanque Verde Peak, a little above 7,000 feet. Then moving east up to Mica Mountain, the highest peak. Moving south down to Rincon Peak. And then that inner corner between those ridges, what I'm calling El Rincón. And I'm going to take you around the mountain, starting from that inner corner and moving clockwise. So that inner corner, which I'm also dubbing the heart of the Rincons, because it just feels like that to me. Some major landmarks: Box Canyon, the super deep canyon that's carved into the south side of Tanque Verde Ridge. Chimenea and Madrona canyons, which are sister canyons that run a very parallel course down from the highest summit of Mica Mountain. And then all of these drainages coming off of these ridges, eventually settling into Rincon Creek. So this inner corner is where you really feel the subtropical influence, and the plant community could be described as almost a subtropical thorn scrub, which is virtually unheard of in the US, meeting Sonoran Desert. So just some photos here to kind of give you a sense of what it feels like on the ground. Rincon Creek after a nice storm. Lots of great bedrock, pools, canyons. This is midway up Chimenea Canyon. This is the west side of Rincon Peak, a really narrow kind of box section of a canyon where there's an incredible oak forest halfway up the mountain. And our first classic representative species of this zone is the feather tree. This is a subtropical legume tree or shrub, depending on conditions. Lysoloma watsonii, feather tree, or tepehuaje. You can see the kind of feathery foliage and white ball-shaped flower clusters. So this is a really notable plant for biogeography, because this corner of the Rincons is the only place in the US where it's known to grow in the wild. And as you can see, its distribution otherwise is basically the state of Sonora. And it's a bit puzzling that it's not known or hasn't been documented in any of the other southern Arizona sky islands. On the right, you see just an iNaturalist screen grab showing all the places where we've documented or just happened to take photos of feather tree. And the amazing thing, as you can see, is that it's not at all rare within this zone of the Rincons. It thrives in this whole band, from Box Canyon, wrapping around to Posta Quemada Canyon, which is a southwest-facing canyon coming off of Rincon Peak. So just some photos of how that looks in habitat in the Rincons. So this is the classic form in the Rincons of more of a spreading form of tree. As you get further south into Sonora, a really majestic, tall-growing tree is going to be the dominant form, like this here, which we do get in the Rincons, but it requires more of a specialized microhabitat where it's getting extra protection from frost. So there it is, tucked up against a cliff. You'll see towering trees in some of the really nice deep bedrock canyons. But it also grows out in the open, most commonly like this, as just a stunted but very lush spreading tree or large shrub. Oh yeah, and this was an incredible shot from last May when we were in really deep drought, and looking across a canyon, hiking up a ridge on the west side of Rincon Peak and seeing that the whole landscape looked really parched. But those green dots are the feather trees, which are somehow still looking lush and happy in those conditions. And when I presented this a couple weeks ago at the herbarium, George Ferguson said that he's seen a similar phenomenon in Sonora in like early spring, where these feather trees are the first things that show a lot of green when everything else is still dormant. So quickly, just a couple more legume species that are subtropical and are at or near their northern range limit in the Rincons that you see in this zone. So the Santa Rita acacia, you can see that distribution there. The desert kidneywood, if you haven't, I highly recommend crushing some leaves and smelling this one. It's uncanny. It's an uncanny tangerine smell. This is another subtropical legume. It's basically reaching its northern limit around the Rincons. Gorgeous pea species that is pretty rare in the Rincons. I've only run into it a couple times. Smooth pod hoary pea tephrosia. You see that distribution, very limited in the US. And this is yet another legume, which was a recent finding, Coville's bundle flower. You see those really spreading, splitting seed pods there in that image. And this one, the distribution, you can see it's really got a strongly subtropical Sonoran desert distribution, kind of hugging the Gulf Coast, and only able to survive in a few places in southern Arizona here. Another one from a different family, from the very tropical lipstick tree family, Vixaceae. This is the Santa Rita yellow show, a very distinctive, kind of odd-looking plant with yellow flowers and these football-shaped seed pods. Again, same theme. There's its distribution. And a nice image of it in habitat. I think that shot was from August, and it's giving you a sense of how lush and tropical the Rincons can feel if they get that summer moisture. One more rare one from this zone to highlight is the skeleton fork fern, Psilotum nudum. This is a really odd, like early evolved fern type that doesn't bear much resemblance to most modern ferns that evolved early on in the kind of fern family lineage. This is a worldwide tropical plant that is extremely rare in Arizona. So there is this one population of this in Chimenea Canyon in the Rincons. As far as Arizona, the only other place we know of it is in the famous Sycamore Canyon in the Atascosas, right by the US-Mexico border. And that's zooming out, so that's its habitat in the Rincon. So it's in this little nook, kind of tucked within two house-sized boulders in the canyon. So it's receiving ultimate protection from frost and getting all that extra humidity from the water coming down. So now moving north up to the Tanque Verde Ridgeline and the north side of Tanque Verde Ridge. This is where we feel the biggest influence of central Arizona chaparral, and much less of the subtropical and southern influence. Got some key landmarks there: Tanque Verde Peak, Juniper Basin, great campground, which I highly recommend. So again, some scenes just to give you a sense of this. It's a much more open, kind of sparse landscape. Low shrubs, grasses. There's an Escobaria cactus. Juniper Basin with kind of rolling oak woodland, chaparral. Riparian habitat within the mostly very open kind of dry landscape. This is up above Juniper Basin, looking down the north side, looking back into Reddington Pass. Again, the summer storm is rolling in. This is a gorgeous oak forest in Upper Wild Horse Canyon, which was a really fun adventure. Probably the most intact, large Madrean oak forest that I've seen on that side of the mountain. Big Arizona white oaks, and maybe silverleaf oaks as well. So getting into a couple characteristic species, the Sonoran scrub oak, as you can see, a very different type of distribution from the previous zone I talked about. So this is really heavily around central Arizona, as well as the Four Corners. A low oak that is common in these chaparral habitats. You see it on Tanque Verde Ridge, but it's kind of drops out in most of the rest of the Rincons. There's a habitat shot. A weird one that I've only found once in just a single specimen is sugar sumac. This is a classic central Arizona species, as well as the California coast, which, you know, they kind of share those the chaparral habitats and share some flora. This is one that maybe was just introduced by a bird that was passing through, and you know, it might have been sourced from an ornamental in town. But even the fact that this was thriving in this random slope above Wild Horse Canyon seemed to be a sign of just the type of plant community that exists in this area. The last one I'll highlight is this cool annual paintbrush, which, so this needs a marshy, a very wet soil mat, or kind of like almost cienega habitat. I've seen this at one nice spot in Wild Horse Canyon, and then it grows near some of the cattle tanks around Reddington. Interesting distribution, very heavily Pacific coast, and then just kind of these disjunct, mostly central Arizona populations, but also the Catalinas and Rincons. So there it is in that kind of marshy habitat. Sort of similar looking to an owl's clover, which some of y'all have probably been seeing this spring. So moving all the way up the mountain to the Mica Mountain summit and Manning Camp, which is a historic cabin that sits at 8,000 feet just south of the Mica Mountain summit. This is where we get really beautiful stands of pine forest, and we get those more northern flora elements. So circumboreal, which is a fancy word for species that are found worldwide in kind of northern temperate latitudes, as well as petron, which is another fun word for Rocky Mountain flora. So this is where you find some of those more Colorado Plateau or chiefly Rocky Mountain species. So again, just giving you a sense of that gorgeous pine forest right by Manning Camp. View from a lookout, looking down on the pines. Ah, yes, and snow, including this year. They got some nice snow up there. This is an aspen grove on the edge of it here, right by Manning Camp. And this sits on the very upper watershed of Chimenea. So the upper Chimenea Creek above the Manning Camp Reservoir. Here's some more shots of that area. And this is a kind of small habitat that I'm going to focus on because this has some really unique flora. It's got some really good water. It's in this like nice sheltered forest. and it has some very unique species. So on the right, that's red osier dogwood, which is a kind of woody vine spreading shrub that you'll see more commonly on Mount Lemmon, but it's this little stretch of the creek by the Aspen Grove is the only place in the Rincons that we know of it. This was one of the rediscovered species back in 2017 that we were looking for. As you can see, really common in temperate North America, but getting sparse this far south. And then just upstream of the dogwood is this alder species, which is even more exceptional as the southernmost occurrence of this species known globally. So in our immediate region, the only other place you see it commonly is in the Pinaleños in Mount Graham. We can see that really northerly distribution, and this is kind of how it grows. It's got a bit of a spreading growth form. There is another more common alder species in the region, Arizona alder, that grows more tall and upright. Here's a Don Swan cameo, taking it all in. There's like a handful of trees just tucked up into this little seepy bedrock area of the creek above the Aspen Grove. And that's kind of how it looks like looking up. You can see all that moss from there's perennial seepage out of the rocks there. And in the same area, an exciting newer finding, I think this was from 2019, is Pipsissewa. This is in the Ericaceae, the heath family. This is a perennial rhizomatous plant. And this is super, super rare in Arizona. You can see that it's got one of these worldwide distributions in temperate zones. But again, other than the Pinaleños, Mount Graham, really unheard of in this region. And there's this very small population on a north-facing bank in this magical little stretch of Upper Chimenea Creek. Here we are piloting a monitoring protocol where we're dividing this kind of like 4x4 meter population into quadrants and getting a rough count to see kind of how they're doing year to year. But yeah, it's just a small area on the forested bank, north facing, associated with all these good moisture conditions in the area. Another fun circumboreal one is this strange fern, the forked spleenwort, which is a lot more common actually in Europe and has a kind of spotty distribution in North America. Because ferns are so ancient and the spores travel so well, you'll get a lot of these like head scratching distributions when it comes to ferns. So this one, there's where its spore structures are tucked into the underside of those very thin grass-like leaves. And it grows from bare rock. So we find this one in granite outcrops high up on Mica Mountain. Just seen it in a few places. As you can see, it's pretty inconspicuous how it's tucked in there. And then for this area, I don't want to discount the Madrean element of the flora at high elevation. This is a cool orchid that we have found and documented just in a few places up in the high south side of Mica Mountain, the Michoacan lady orchid. You can see well distributed through the Sierra Madre, rare up here in Arizona. That's its growth form coming up from those fleshy basal leaves. This is the latest blooming of the local orchid. So this is often not flowering until late summer or even into the fall. Now wrapping around to the north side of Mica Mountain, where we have mixed conifer forest. So this is really where you see a heavy Douglas fir presence and a spotty white fir presence. A lot of springs as well as some local endemics. I'll take you around there. There's a nice waterfall in a canyon. On the right, there's a white fir growing amidst looks like some aspen and some walnut. Some open mixed conifer forest on the north side of Helen's Dome, big rock outcrop. Canyons, springs. This is a new one we found that we called Manna Grass Spring, after that dominant grass that's filling up the spring course. Looking down into the boulder maze in the Forest Service land from high up on the north slope through a little fire scar. So some recent fire history has been very significant in this area. The Helens 2 fire in 2003 was quite devastating. So we see the wreckage of that, which is very visible from the North Slope Trail, which kind of traverses the North Slope at around like an 8,000 foot contour. Yeah, this was a really devastating one that that nuked a lot of mixed conifer forest up there. However, this amazing canyon, or this amazing drainage, West Joaquin, was able to withstand the Helens 2 fire. So you see fire scar on either side of this canyon, but it's just so particularly wet and lush that it was able to withstand, and thank God, because it's a really special habitat for plants. Including the Rocky Mountain maple, which is gets pretty rare down here in southern Arizona. Very common part of the plant community in West Joaquin Canyon. Quite spotty elsewhere on the north slope of the Rincons. Needs a lot of moisture and good soil conditions. There it is in a more open context east of there. This is kind of in an area that burned in 1994. The trees are still hanging on in this area. It'll be interesting to see how they, how they do moving forward, because they don't have as much shelter and canopy as other areas. There's a contrast of that more open habitat where the maple's growing. Then on the right, that's West Joaquin Canyon, where it's within this really intact mixed conifer forest. In West Joaquin, there's also a very locally uncommon orchid, the striped coral root. This is a parasitic orchid that grows out of leaf litter, or sorry, more like branch litter, I guess the needle litter as well. But this parasitizes mycorrhizal fungi that are associated with the conifers. So it's kind of an interesting like three-way association. This species I've only found in that West Joaquin corridor. So again, highlighting how important that remaining stretch of mixed conifer forest is. There it is growing out of the downed branches and logs. Another rare orchid on the north side. This was one of the rediscoveries. Thurber's bog orchid. You can see this is really a Madrean species that reaches its northern limit up here in the Catalinas and Rincons. It's more abundant in the Catalinas. In the Rincons, we've only found it at this one spring on the northeast side, known as Art Spring, which was named after a firefighter who me and Don have met, who worked in the Rincons in the 60s and dug out that bottom pool to allow water access for firefighters doing remote operations. One more spring species on the north side, which was a very exciting finding a few years ago, was lady fern. So this is another iconic circumboreal species across the globe in temperate latitudes, but very uncommon in our region. Needs really good water, needs like a good high forested habitat. Very big, dramatic fern. There's the underside. Another spring-dependent species is this red monkey flower, which traditionally was called scarlet monkey flower, which is a very well-known species in California. Recent research by a plant taxonomist has actually separated our Sky Island region red monkey flowers into a different species that appears to be a local endemic species. So the Rincons now are the fourth Sky Island mountain range where this one is known. And this is this amazing spring, which is the only drainage in the Rincons where we have seen it. So this is a very lush spring within the Helens 2 fire area. And the monkey flowers are really thriving in this area and continue downstream of the spring a little ways. And then quickly, we also have these localized endemic species that pop up around Mica Mountain and the North Slope. So this is one example. This is a strange, skinny mustard species, the Rincon rock cress, which is scattered around pine forests in that zone of the Rincons, and otherwise in the world only known in the Santa Ritas, the Huachucas, and the Chiricahuas. And there's some more examples of these like very limited Sky Island endemics, some of which have only been described in recent times. I do see that it's 10:30. I know we started late, so probably going for at least another 10 minutes. So I hope that most people can stick around. Wrapping around now to the east side of Mica Mountain, where we have the strongest Madrean element, where you see these like really well-developed closed canopy Madrean forests and those springs that Bloomer was talking about, all that soil moisture that pops up. So there's a scene and some key landmarks. This is Spud Rock Spring, which is a campground I talked about earlier on the east side. This is like the closest thing we get in the Rincons to a true mountain wet meadow. I think historically it was a true wet meadow. It's gotten more ephemeral in recent drought, but still retains a lot of that character and has some of those species. I highly recommend visiting Spud Rock Spring if you can. It's a really special place. So there's a view of that meadow-like opening amongst the pine oak forest. Here's some more springs, just to give you a sense of how leafy and deciduous and dense this area can get with plants. It really is a stark contrast to other zones of the Rincons.
Wow.
Some more springs. This is Deer Creek on the northeast side. Another spring in Upper Turkey Creek. And then lower down in Turkey Creek, this is a spring that's it's around 4,800 feet elevation that you can see from the trail because that deciduous patch of green pops from afar. So this is down at ground level of Turkey Creek Spring, and you'll immediately notice this giant fern, which is another very unique species in the region and in the Rincons. In the Rincons, only found at this one spring. So this is the giant chain fern, Woodwardia fimbriata. It has the distinction of being the largest native fern in North America. And again, this seems to be kind of a relic from wetter times where it's now mostly restricted to the Pacific coast, but has these very localized populations hanging on around springs and other really wet habitats in Arizona. So there it is. It follows the spring course as the spring water flows down the slope from the source. There's those huge fronds hanging over the spring course. On the right, that's kind of the source where water starts pooling up out of the soil. And you can see that understory is no joke. That is chiefly dewberry or Arizona blackberry, mixed in with poison ivy for good measure. So it's a place where you really don't want to fall down if possible. And there's that dewberry, or often called Arizona blackberry species. This is like our local endemic native blackberry, which is definitely most prominent on the east side of Mica Mountain. Another cool recent finding was Lemon's milkweed, which is a really distinctive super madrean species that at that point had not been recorded north of I-10. So this was a nice little northern range extension. And then recently someone found it on a naturalist in the Catalinas, and that needs to be followed up on. But this was just thriving in a little zone kind of near Turkey Creek Spring. Didn't catch it flowering, but with those big broad leaves and hairy stems, it's pretty striking even without flowers. Another recent finding was this very big, robust grass that is dependent on perennial water. This is one that's been really decimated in California by groundwater pumping and agriculture. Used to be a more common species in valley bottoms. There's that beautiful satiny seed head. And there's the habitats. This is more open in Miller Creek Canyon, but this is just a local population that's feasting on a seeping bedrock fracture. And this is another one that's really rare in the Sky Island region. Haven't found this anywhere else in the Rincons yet. We really love to. Moving south to the east side of Rincon Peak, this is an area where there's no established trails. And as you can see from the map, the topography gets pretty scary steep towards the top. So not surprisingly, there was very little collection history from this area. But if you tread carefully, it's really worth it. It's a really unique zone of the Rincon. So this is an area that I've focused on quite a bit, especially in the last few years. So this is marked by big forests of Arizona cypress, which itself is like a Pleistocene relic and is diminishing in the region and just kind of hanging on in certain choice microhabitats. This is the only area of the Rincons where there's a lot of cypress. There's these big cliffs, which presumably shelter those forests. And given this wild topography and cliffs, there's a lot of really unique madrean flora that you don't find elsewhere in the Rincons. So giving you a sense of this, this is Upper Page Creek Canyon, which is the main drainage coming off of the east side of Rincon Peak. We were about to get totally hammered by a storm in a couple hours here. This might have been after that, the stream flow downstream. Aerial view looking down into a branch of Page Creek Canyon. Just a super dramatic, rocky, cliffy habitat with all that cypress. And there's some of my intrepid co-surveyors going up the forest. Got a SIA Biotech, former Park Biotech Andres there on the right. A few, got a handful of species to highlight here. Couple of cool lip ferns. So this is a very Madrean lip fern that reaches its northern range extent in the Rincons. You can see it's got a really intricate shape to the fronds and then those hair-like scales on the backside. That's a really nice close-up of those hair-like scales. And it grows, it's kind of, scattered just in moist, usually somewhat shaded banks along the canyon. Then an even rarer lip fern, which we found a few years ago, high up, tucked into one of those sheer cliffs up towards the top, is the Arizona lip fern. And this was a northern range extension, super rare in Arizona. gorgeous kind of lacy foliage to it. There's the habitat, so you can see it's really sheltered within those rocks, places where water is flowing down, seeping out. This was a downright puzzling one that we still need to follow up on more. This appeared to key out to an eastern species, this little annual dwarf dandelion. This was the first record of it in the western US. So this could be some kind of new subspecies or variety or even species. I'd love to get some experts to work on this population. You can see this was just a tiny little dandelion. This grows out of marshy, kind of mossy, saturated mats that are on the bedrock in that area. That's where we found it. And there we are revisiting that very special mossy mat. More rare sunflowers. So we have this fleabane that is, as far as we know, in Arizona endemic. This is a small one that grows just out of cliffs. So we found it high up, kind of towards where that Arizona lip fern is. And it's pretty inconspicuous. It's tucked into the cliffs and the rock cracks. Another cool sunflower family one, Cliff False Golden Aster. This is kind of a strange distribution, more eastern. Some of these cliff-dwelling species, it's just such a unique and restricted habitat that they can have some pretty strange distributions and often have a tendency to speciate into endemics. So this is growing high and dry on some ridge tops above those canyons. This was one, a scorpion weed species that my colleague Ethan Ward found further down in the Forest Service land. And this is an example of one of these local endemics where there's really just 4 populations known thus far. Beautiful scorpion weed that was first described from the Sonoyta Creek area. Here's some close-ups. All right, I better quickly run through the rest of this so we can get some questions. Moving to the south side of Rincon Peak, where we have additional subtropical and Madrean flora, more bedrock canyons, very difficult to access, mostly in the Forest Service land. Posta Quemada Canyon is the big drainage coming off the peak, and Distillery Canyon is a really unique kind of boxy one that has some unique flora. So I'll take you there, looking down into that box. Waterfalls. Here it is from ground level. And a very unique species that we know of only in this canyon in terms of the Rincons is Tillandsia, this epiphyte ball moss. Big shout out to the Spring Seeker program and Sammy Hammer and Britt Rosso. They were the ones who first photographed this and sent me the information and helped me follow up on it. So here's the Tillandsia just blanketing this rosewood. Ash here. Another one from afar. Almost looks like it's weighing down this rosewood. And it's common in this zone and presumably just, enjoying that protection from the boxy canyon topography and the southern aspect. Another recent finding was this morning glory, which is a super Madrean species. Ethan found this midway up the south side of Rincon Peak. A unique local endemic hedgehog cactus, which we also get on the east side of Rincon Peak and wrapping around a little bit to the southwest side. Not really sure what's going on here. It's mostly known otherwise in the Pinaleños, a little bit in the Chiricahuas, Santa Teresa's. Gorgeous bright pink flowers. Pretty distinctive with those cylindrical golden stems and downward spines. And then our last quick detour will be in the Colossal Cave foothills. So this is the foothills of the south side of Rincon Peak. This has a interesting limestone geology, which I would need a geologist to talk the nitty gritty of. But this just hosts some really interesting disjunct Chihuahuan species that are evolved to thrive on this limestone. It has some really interesting plants. See, here's how it feels on the ground. This kind of low, shrubby desert scrub with a really rough limestone substrate. I'm just going to highlight two species. This is a berberis, a barberry, known as agarita, which you can see is a super puzzling disjunct, a thoroughly Chihuahuan desert species that somehow is really common just in this one area around Colossal Cave, but is not known, I don't think, anywhere else in Arizona. And like the feather tree in the inner corner, I mean, this is quite common in this little local region. And then one similar one, which was new for the flora that we found a couple years ago, was this really cute milkwort shrub. Again, a similar story. There's a couple known occurrences, or a handful in southern Arizona, but you can see that is chiefly a Chihuahuan desert type of plant. So there's that growth form coming out of the straight limestone bedrock. In habitat. And that's the end of the tour. Thank you for bearing with the technological difficulties. Thank you for attending. And I did want to quickly thank Don Swan for being so creative and kind of giving me the opportunity to start on this journey and support me through this project, as well as all of the surveyors who went out with me and lended their enthusiasm and sweat and hard work to these surveys, and all the park administrators and folks behind the scenes who allowed this project to happen. So thank you very much, and happy to field questions from anyone who's still around.
Well, thank you, Dan. I'm sure I can speak for many of us that it made us want to put on our hiking boots and get up there and see these amazing corners of the Rincons. It's just so hard to imagine down here in Tucson looking up and realizing how many different habitats are up there. We have had a few questions come in, and one was a question from Ken, who asks, are you aware of any clear advantages of the removal of feral cattle in the 1980s? It sounds like they were in the upper canyon areas and were removed.
I mean, I can't like specifically speak to that, but I think it's hard to argue that that was not helpful. And I think, yeah, I mean, the greater like kind of wilderness character of the Rincons, with the lack of roads and the very limited grazing, at least like not really getting into the higher elevations. It does have, I think, a more pristine wilderness character than most other local ranges. So yeah, I mean, I think further down, like in areas on the east side where you see areas where cattle are still getting into, like there is a difference of, as people here know, of seeing springs that are just really trampled and disturbed and dug up versus these places higher up the mountain. So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's portions of the Rincons where you see that grazing history, just the effects of like grazing earlier in the century, in the 20th century. But yeah, I mean, I think excluding them in modern times has undoubtedly been helpful.
Mm-hmm. Have you been picking up invasive species in the Rincons? I mean, in the areas. I mean, just how far up in elevation are invasive species a problem in the park?
Yeah. That kind of dovetails nicely with the last question, because the lack of a road like the Catalina Highway and like not having much human infrastructure in the upper elevations does mean that there is a really marked contrast of like a much more limited invasive problem in like the high elevations of the Rincons. I mean, it's pretty night and day compared to the Catalinas. Um, I think what we are seeing, which is worrisome, is just the possibly expanding elevational ranges of some of our key problematic desert invasives. So, you know, we see buffalo grass climbing up above 5,000 feet, fountain grass in the canyons, also sometimes getting very high. Um, so, and of course, we're worried about kind of what stinknet is doing now and what it might do in the future. But yeah, luckily the true like mountain invasives are pretty limited. I mean, I have also, of course, in the course of this work, found some additional invasives for the flora, some localized population. You know, we found a little population of bull thistle at one of the springs above Manning Camp, but it's pretty limited and contained. I think, yeah, it's just those grasses that just keep marching up slope that just seem impossible to manage.
Yeah. Two more quick questions. Do you have a recommendation for an easy access point, a starter place to get up into the Rincons, like a trailhead, or what you would suggest people check out?
Yeah, I think if you drive over to the east side, if you take the freeway to the Mescal Road exit and go north of Mescal Road, the Miller Creek Trailhead is, I think, a really nice trail that's a very reasonable day hike that in 4 miles will take you to a pine forested saddle there at Happy Valley Saddle, around 6,000 feet. You can also camp there if you want. Um, that's a nice sense of just like that eastern Madrean side of the Rincons. Um, from here, if you want to do like a relatively easy backpacking trip, I really recommend Juniper Basin, which is the trailheads off the Loop Drive, Tanque Verde Ridge trailhead. It is like a 7 mile hike up there. So not like the easiest hike, but you know, it's a nice campground. It's a little like oasis of riparian forest up there. And it's a cool place to see kind of the changing habitats going up Tanque Verde Ridge.
Thank you. Okay, more questions coming in. Have there been any differentiation noted between the cypress trees in the Rincon and the Santa Catalina Mountains that you're aware of?
I don't think so, but I'm not. Yeah, I mean they're all just considered the same Arizona cypress species, but I don't know beyond that. I know there has been some recent uh, local research into just the kind of the demographics and maybe like future projections for these dwindling cypress forests in the region that Jim Barrier has written a couple articles like doing demographic studies in um, the Dragoons, I think some of the other Sky Islands, and just kind of looking at what the patterns, kind of how those populations are doing. And I mean, I think there is certainly long term concern just about you know climate change, just like kind of making it more and more challenging for those forests, and an expectation that they will dwindle over time. And I mean, even on the east side of Rincon Peak, we see like all this amazing cypress canopy, but I mean, you might have noticed in the photos from that area, there's a lot of mortality too. I mean, you see a lot of snags, you see a lot of down trees. So, um, you know, they're one of these ice age relics that are kind of slowly losing the fight to climate change. I think probably the best we can do is like having progressive fire management and like prescribed burns that try and restore some healthy fire dynamics in those areas. But yeah, it's tough with the heat and the drought.
Yeah. Well, Dan, thank you so much. I feel like all of us want to watch your talk again to reacquaint ourselves with these new plants and figure out where we're going to go hiking and everything like that. I see the question about chances to help remove invasive grasses, especially from spring sites. Saguaro National Park is going to be reinvigorating their volunteer program to address exactly this, removing invasive plants from the front country. So hopefully more opportunities, and we'll help share those opportunities coming up this year. And yes, we'd love to see Dan do this work in other sky islands and to compare and contrast what's going on our other mountain ranges. So hopefully that's the work to come in the coming years. We're really excited that Dan is going to be partnering with us and maintaining the strong partnership with Saguaro National Park. So Dan, thank you again. Thank you to everyone who joined us this morning. We'll be sending out the recording when it's available. Have a good day, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.